has been published in journals such as Discourse, Context and Media, Critical Discourse Studies, Social Semiotics, Visual Communication, and Text and Talk. She is co-editor of the volumes of Critical Multimodal Studies of Popular Discourse and Advancing Multimodal and Critical Discourse Studies. She serves on the editorial boards of the international journals Multimodality and Society, Multimodal Communication Journal, and Linguistics and Education. She is also a founding member of the PAN-MEMIC. Everyone, we will be listening the next plenary entitled Critical Multimodal Approaches to Evaluating Materials and Pedagogies in TESOL Contexts. For on-site participants who wants to ask a question, you will be given opportunities at the question and answer session. For online participants, please use the chat box. Also, you can raise your hands later at the Q&A session. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Emilia Djonov.
Thank you so much for coming to this presentation. And first of all, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to present at this excellent hybrid event, this mega conference, and for all their work in organizing such an exciting hybrid event. I wish I could be on site at Universitas Negeri Malang. I really enjoyed the opening ceremony yesterday and can imagine that it must have been even more impressive for people who were there in the conference hall. I particularly want to thank Dr. Yusnita Febrianti for the lovely introduction and also for being my very patient contact person at the conference, helping me with all my questions. I am honored to be one of the plenary speakers at the 20th AsiaTEFL conference. This is a stellar line of plenary and keynote speakers, and it won't be, I won't be exaggerating if I say that this is making my task of presenting today even more daunting, particularly because TEFL is a field that I mainly have indirect experience in, and most of what I know in that field I have learned from my very, very capable higher degree research students who I've supervised. Okay, so what I'll be focusing on is hopefully highlighting the value of taking a multimodal and in some cases a critical multimodal approach to evaluating materials and pedagogies in different kinds of TESOL contexts, and I'll do that by showcasing the work of three of my excellent former or current higher degree research students. So I'll be focusing on the work of Sang Jung-jo, who explored the multimodal construal of English as a global language in Korean EFL textbooks for primary school children. Then I'll move on to consider some of the interesting findings and implications of the work of Sompato Vongtong, who did her PhD focusing on new technologies for teaching children English as a foreign language in Thailand. And finally, a thesis that Stafford Lumsden is currently putting the finishing touches to, a multimodal social semiotic approach to the community of inquiry framework, which focuses on teacher education in TESOL. Professor Kessler yesterday mentioned that our students learn despite us, and I think this applies to the three former and current students whose work I've selected to showcase today. They all approached me because of my background and research in critical discourse analysis and multimodality, and also to some extent systemic functional linguistics and social semiotics. And what I have learned from them is an awful lot about TESOL and TEFL teacher education, especially but not only in Asia. Before I move on to present a little bit about each of those studies, I'd like to just briefly say what I mean by critical multimodal analysis. So basically what we have with critical multimodal analysis is that we're bringing together two traditions, the tradition of multimodality and multimodal discourse analysis, where the focus is on how different semiotic resources, different modes and media of communication combine to make meaning. We study both their meaning potential, but also how they interact in multimodal interactions and multimodal texts. Combining that with critical discourse analysis, which is where we focus on how communication, and most of the studies up until maybe a decade ago were primarily focusing on language, on how communication conceals and legitimizes or reveals and perhaps subverts social divisions and inequality, drawing on critical and social theories. So combining multimodal discourse analysis with critical discourse analysis gives us what I call critical multimodal discourse analysis, which is where the focus is on how not only language but other semiotic resources and multimodal interaction can perpetuate or perhaps challenge and subvert maybe prevailing sociocultural beliefs, stereotypes and norms. And in this presentation I'll focus on some beliefs and stereotypes and norms to do with language teaching, particularly with English. So first of all, let us look at the study of Sang Jong-jo, who looked at, as I said, the multimodal construal of English as a global language in Korean EFL textbooks for primary school children. She focused on grade 3 English textbooks approved by the government for Korean primary schools. Grade 3, when children are about 8 to 9 years of age, is where English is introduced as a compulsory subject. And her research question was, to what extent do the images and multimodal representations of characters in grade 3 textbooks for English address the curriculum requirement that English should be represented and students should be taught to value it as a global language. So just a bit more of the context. So there is a requirement that has been introduced very formally in 2007, but is also in earlier documents, to present English as a global language for bonding between people of different native languages, for forming trust among various countries and cultures and understanding of foreign cultures, and develop an international appreciation and a cooperative spirit as a cosmopolitan citizen in these children. And images are particularly important here, but also multimodal communication in general for these children who are not only learning English but obviously learning to read and write in English. So the theoretical and methodological foundations of Sang's study included Crescent van Leeuwen's Reading Images, the Grammar of Visual Design, looking at how images represent these different characters. Combining that with Van Leeuwen's framework for analyzing how social actors are visually represented. So this is going beyond who is included and who is excluded, who is or isn't represented, but actually looking also at how they are represented. And then combining that with Catru's model of the 3 circles models of world Englishes, which many of you would be familiar with, where basically a key distinction is made between the inner circle, the traditional English-speaking countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom, the outer circle, countries such as India perhaps, where English is not traditionally the native tongue but has an institutional role to play, and the expanding circle, countries where English is learned as a foreign language. And so what Sang did was look at 5 textbooks that were approved by the government for public schools, and then from each textbook she took 2 units from each study. The first unit, the first sort of lesson if you like, which was focusing on introductions, and then another unit that she was able to find in all the 5 textbooks that had a similar kind of focus across the textbooks, where students were being presented with an excursion to a farm or a zoo. So in those 2 units she identified 162 images that depicted human characters, 513 characters altogether. And among these human characters, there were 19 characters, all adults, who were represented as being in roles of authority, a teacher or a guide in the zoo, someone who knows things. And so what we then did was to develop criteria for coding characters, nationalities and ethnic backgrounds, depending on how much information, which could be visual but could also be verbal, was given about these characters in relation to where they came from. So distinguishing expanding circle characters from Korea from inner circle characters, outer circle characters, expanding circle other than Korea, but also some who we were not told explicitly which particular country or nationality they came from, but we were able from other characteristics to classify as unclear inner or unclear outer or unclear altogether. Going beyond just looking at the characters and how they're represented as belonging to one or another of Kachru's circles, we also looked at how interactions are represented. So which characters are represented as interacting with which other characters. And so there were various possibilities here in terms of Korean characters interacting with other Korean characters with inner circle characters, and so on. Okay, so just flagging some of the findings, not all the findings of that research, but some of the interesting findings is that at face value, like initially we thought, okay, well, there's no significant difference between the number of characters who are represented from the inner circle, 6% or so, 6.24%, 32 characters, and the number of characters from the outer or expanding circle other than Korea, again 6%. But then when you look a little bit deeper, then you notice that, for example, Korean students consistently appear in all images, but other outer and expanding circle characters are rarely included in the representation of learning events. And usually they are introduced only when they are introduced to introduce their different nationalities, different cultures. Okay, so what does that say about who Korean characters that are represented as learners in these events, who they should see as interactants with whom they could use the target language, right? We also noticed that outer and expanding circle other than Korea were never depicted in institutional roles of authority, while 70% of all authority representations were either Korean or inner circle. So here you have the teacher, for example, here you have a guide in the zoo. And we also noticed that expanding circle characters other than those from Korea, from countries such as China, Thailand, Brazil, and so on, were not really represented as interacting with characters from other nationalities, but just represented as those characters here to introduce their culture. Okay? So to what extent then is English represented as a global language, and what does that mean for the extent to which that curriculum requirement to teach children not only to learn English obviously, but to value English as a global language can be met? And one of the important things that this highlights is the role that teachers play in meeting that curriculum requirement if they're going to use textbooks like that in the classroom. Now, this was a Master of Research study, which is very, very intensive at my university, and so some did not look at how the textbooks were used in the classroom. But this is something that the actual use of an English language teaching materials was something that Sumpato Vongtong, now Assistant Professor Dr. Sumpato Vongtong and King Mongkut's University of Technology Thonburi now, she looked at in her PhD. So she was interested in looking at the one tablet per child project in Thailand, which was introduced in 2012, and it cost a lot of money, 150 million US dollars just by mid 2013. And this initiative, the aim was to promote quality education for all Thai primary students, and it included not just distributing tablets, but also developing apps to be included, or curriculum materials to be included on those tablets. And Sumpato Vongtong was really interested in the English apps for grade 1 and grade 2. Now, a bit of context for those of you who may not know much about Thailand, as I didn't when Sumpato started her project. English in primary schools in Thailand had been a compulsory subject since 1996, from grade 1 when children are about 6 years old. And some of the key issues was the paucity of teachers with high English language proficiency and also who are able to teach English to children, because that's a different kind of challenge. I'm sure you would agree to teaching adults, perhaps. There are also limited opportunities for authentic communication and very large classes with limited motivation compared to, say, people who are learning English as a second language in the context where it is spoken all around them. Here I've got some images from the grade 1 English app and the grade 2 English app, just for you to give you a bit of a sense of how they looked. Okay, so a very, very complex study, and there's no way that I could do it justice in the short time that I have today. But Vong Tong explored a range of different questions in her research. One of them was looking at the actual design of the apps from a multimodal perspective and looking at what is the potential of the multimodal design of these apps to support language teaching and learning. Specifically, she looked at visual-verbal relations in some of the sections of the apps that the teachers said in the survey that they used predominantly for vocabulary, and looking whether those visual-verbal relations can support vocabulary instruction. So what is their potential? What is their limitations? And to be able to do that, she used systemic functional multimodal discourse analysis and also content analysis of the different kinds of visual-verbal relations. And she noticed that there was an important difference between the grade 1 app and the grade 2 app, in that when children would go to the grade 2 app, this is where images became much more complex. And so it was even more important than for children to have an adult, a teacher, who cannot be replaced by the technology, to really guide them in what it is they're supposed to notice in that image, what are the words and the concepts that they were being taught in that vocabulary lesson. But similarly, of course, there are many cultural nuances of the meaning of words that teachers needed to explain. The app itself was not enough to replace teachers, could not replace teachers. Sampato also looked at what factors influenced teachers' decisions to use the grade 2 tablet in the classroom, because she conducted a large survey of completed by 213 grade 2 English teachers. Grade 2 because they had already used the tablet for a year, they were already familiar with it. And she also looked at some interviews with teachers and the open-ended questions in that survey to look at what teachers thought about the app, but also its potential to support children as EFL learners. And something that I'll focus on in a bit more detail right now is a study that we've only just freshly published, where she looked at how teachers' multimodal choices, speech, gesture, and pedagogic, the use of space in the classroom, are employed when they incorporate the tablet app in their classrooms. Okay, so very briefly, let me highlight a few findings. So here we have from the teacher survey, from just the content analysis, we see that technical problems was the main factor preventing English teachers from using the apps. So before you even get to consider the content of the apps, the content of what is presented, to evaluate them as teaching materials. So actually the technology itself needs to be supported from a very basic material perspective, if you want. In terms of teachers' views on the potential of the grade 2 app for children's English language learning, we noticed that teachers mentioned things that we then classified as affective factors and things like learner autonomy and so on, which were learner-oriented potential of the apps. But also a lot of teachers mentioned specific English language skills that they felt the app was particularly good at supporting. Especially, we had lots of teachers mentioning pronunciation and accent and giving students models of a native speaker accent. So native speakerism is well and truly alive. But also things like listening skills, vocabulary, and so on. So some of the takeaway messages from the survey then was that professional development and training for the teachers was an important factor in the uptake of these new technologies, and that the materials must correspond to the curriculum and support learning But we also need to consider the quality of the technology, the hardware itself, and also think about quality, but also equity. So some teachers reported, well, in my school, students are not allowed to take them home, which is kind of, if you want to, it kind of goes against the purpose of the one tablet per child project and that focus on one-to-one kind of technologies and learning. Okay, so one of the other sort of messages here was that how the technology is actually integrated in the classroom may reflect teachers' approaches to English as a foreign language and also their beliefs about children as EFL learners. And this takes me to this study that I mentioned that we've just published now, but here in that publication we've only focused on speech and gestures. In that study, Sumpato focused on 2 classroom observations, 2 different teachers, each class about 35 students in 2 different schools. Teacher A is 30 years old, 1-year teaching experience. In that school, in school A, students were not allowed to take the tablet home. Teacher B from school 2, male, 48 years old, 13 years of teaching experience at the time, and students in that school were allowed to take the tablet home. Okay, so she video recorded those lessons, approximately 40 minutes each, and they were both using the Grade 2 English app. In terms of theory and methodology, she conducted systemic functional analysis of the teacher's speech, whether it was in English or in Thai. She considered what kind of ideational, interpersonal, and also textual to do with cohesion and coherence meanings were constructed. She looked at the gestures, again from the perspective of those 3 types of meaning. And also her critical social framework was Basil Bernstein's framework for looking at pedagogic discourse as having 2 main components: instructional, which in this case is about to do with how they teach their subject, in this case to do with the teaching of English. And regulative discourse is also part of pedagogic discourse, how teachers manage the classroom interactions, how they manage the pacing, the sequencing of activities, and so on. Okay. So just something to highlight, the app itself is designed sort of more or less in line with the communicative language teaching approach. And each lesson was broken down into these different sections: vocabulary, let's read, let's study, and so on and so forth for each topic. But we have very different ways in which they were integrated into the classroom. And in classroom A, where students could not take the app home, actually a lot more use of the app was done to really engage with English language content than in class B, where the focus was primarily on giving instructions and going through 4 different lessons rather than just 1, and telling students what they had to do at home in explaining how they should access the app and so on. In terms of the analysis of speech and gestures, we notice interesting differences too. So in terms of the instructional register, the focus on teaching English, both teachers focused less on that than on the regulative register, on the management of the classroom, if you like, and the technology. But teacher A only made her students access 1 lesson called At the Supermarket, and her focus was a lot on students' ability to comprehend the content. So she would ask questions, so often in English and then repeating them in Thai, and say things like checking whether they understood the lesson, what they had read and what they had seen. So she'd ask, what did the mother and the daughter eat for lunch? She also used gestures to give them prompts when they couldn't supply the answer. So for example, when they couldn't supply the answer to that question, she would make a long thin line sort of with her gestures to suggest what the answer could be, and then students provided the correct answer, which was noodles. Teacher B did not ask about the content of the lesson, nor did he really focus on the lesson, but he did focus a lot on individual words and asking things like, hello means what, where means what was in Thai, right? So a lot of that sort of very grammar translation kind of method that is not really in line with the way the app is designed. Both teachers, in terms of the regulative register, both teachers used both speech and gesture to realize that register, but somewhat differently. So teacher A would sort of say things like, today we are going to the supermarket, and direct her students to go to the lesson, let's go to the supermarket. She might use gesture to point to specific content in the app, and the things that teachers do. I'll give you 10 minutes for this, or go here, go there, and so on. Teacher B didn't really orient students to the lesson's topic, but asked them to access the app, so turn on the tablet, and also often used polar interrogatives to check whether they understood. But again, the understanding was not to do with the content, but to do with how do you access the app. So the same app was used very differently to present EFL content in the two lessons, and that reflected the teachers' different approaches to English teaching, and also different differences in maybe the school context, because teacher B asked the students to take who could take the app home to complete certain activities at home. So a lot of the focus was really on helping them navigate the app rather than the content of the app. Okay, so moving on. This is perhaps the most tricky study for me to explain, because I'm still getting my head around it. Let's look at Stafford Lumsden's PhD study, in which what he did is, so we're moving here to TESOL teacher education contexts, and what he wanted to do was to provide support to online TESOL instructors to increase teaching, social and cognitive presence, the key components of the community of inquiry framework, to increase those presences through understanding and using different semiotic resources in their online learning environments. So first of all, he wanted to find out what semiotic resources, other than language choices themselves, so other than language, what non-linguistic semiotic resources are exploited by online TESOL teacher education instructors. And then also find out whether these semiotic resources were perceived by students as helping to establish teaching presence, social presence, and cognitive presence. And then also he developed a targeted professional development intervention that focused specifically on multimodality in online learning and teaching environments to assist these TESOL instructors to implement different semiotic resources in these ways that they could improve their online teaching and learning. Okay, so the key, for those of you familiar with that framework, it will already be clear that one of the things that the main sort of contribution of Stafford Lumsden's study here is that he's taking the community of inquiry framework, which is a very well established framework for designing, developing and delivering online teaching and learning, and incorporates three presences. Teaching presence, which is to do with all the things that teachers do, planning the course and the subject, facilitating interactions, maybe even discourse during an individual task, providing feedback and directions. Social presence, which is the ability of all participants in the learning community, or the subject if you like, to share their beliefs, feelings and personality, both online and off, and to establish trust and relationships with each other. And cognitive presence, so these are the teaching, social and cognitive presence, where cognitive presence is to do with learners being given opportunities to construct meaning through different kinds of activities, individual, peer, small and large group work and so on, and providing them with opportunities to engage in higher order thinking and collaborate and reflect on their learning. So that's the cognitive presence. So these three types of presences are the key components of the community of inquiry framework, which was developed by Garrison et al. And then Stafford, what he has done here is change the representation to highlight the interdependence of these different presences and the key role that teaching presence plays in that, in having a successful community of inquiry online. So what he did was to really take a multimodal social semiotic perspective and combine it with that framework and look at how resources, non-linguistic resources such as discussion boards, audio, hyperlinks, images, typography and so on, video, could be employed to improve those presences. As part of that, he also adapted what is known as the Community of Inquiry Survey Instrument, which was developed by Arbo et al. 2008, And it is really an instrument where students can say to what extent, how they evaluate these, the degree to which in an online learning environment there is teaching presence, cognitive presence and social presence. So it's got 34 items which have different subcategories for each of the presences, and it uses Likert scale where students can say whether they, to what extent they agree or disagree with each of those the presence of each of those presences. So it's a very, very complex study. I can't really take you through all the details. So he started in 2019, so before the pandemic hit, and he had 6 different classes, 6 different TESOL teacher education classes, 3 of them in Korea, where the learning management system used was Google Classroom, and 3 in Australia, where the learning management system was Moodle. And you can see here that for some of these classes there was a shift in instructors, but all the instructors actually completed the intervention that staff had developed, and here we have the students who participated in the survey in stage 1 and stage 3. So he conducted a survey of practice before the intervention, where he adapted the survey to include questions about the way, the extent to which these different non-linguistic resources students felt that they contributed or not to the different presences. He conducted interviews with the instructor participants, and he also developed a content analysis approach to counting the instances that different resources, the number of times different resources were used in the online learning environments for each of those classes. Then he developed the intervention, which he delivered online, and then he conducted the same survey of practice. Here in the intervention, the instructors had to, at the end of the intervention, come up with a goal that they wanted to implement into their online learning environment. And so in stage 3, in the post-intervention stage, he conducted again the community of inquiry survey that he had adapted to make it more multimodal. He conducted interviews with the instructors, and he did again a content analysis of their online learning environments. So just very briefly, let me highlight some of the findings. Something that was quite interesting to us, given that all of these non-linguistic resources are there, is that in the pre-intervention stage, but continuing into the post-intervention stage, we see the dominance of written language. If you look at this graph that shows how the frequency of different resources, look at typeface, typography, and so on. So even though he was looking at the non-linguistic aspects of written language in these learning environments, again, the dominance of written language was evident in the dominance of typography, the dominance of different choices to do with font color and font size, and so on and so forth. Similarly, students in the pre-intervention stage, when they were asked what did the instructor use to help you know them and to help you know other students, so this is really getting at social presence, effective expression. Again, students said that written instructions was what contributed the most. And only afterwards we have things like video and so on. Okay. Now for that same class that I showed you, class F here, I've just taken this example, and it's interesting that post-intervention we can see some interesting changes. For example, we see that typography remains, the orange is the post-intervention. Typography remains the most dominant semiotic resource in that online learning environment for that class, but video content increased considerably. So there were now 60 videos created by the instructor participant in the study, up from 6 at the beginning of the study. And there were internally created videos, which was kind of interesting. Now, evaluating the intervention is something that Stafford also did. And we can see here, again, this was quite tricky because you would appreciate that all these 6 classes had to move to completely online delivery. And things had changed quite a lot. So in evaluating the intervention, we can see, for example, here, before the intervention, and after the intervention, we can see an increase in teaching presence from the student's perspective. cognitive presence staying more or less the same, and social presence decreasing. And again, that has probably a lot to do with the fact that everything had moved online. So, and we can also see a shift in the use of different, not just in the use of different resources, but also in how students perceived them as contributing to the different presences. So, for example, in the post-intervention, the green bar here, you can see that video was perceived as contributing to all three presences, the teaching, the cognitive, and the social presence, a lot more than pre-intervention. And of course, here we also have a lot more video conferencing too to account for. And finally, just wanted to highlight the value of this study for developing opportunities for reflective practice. So the adapted community of inquiry survey, with that focus on semiotic resources, for example, could be used by an instructor, a teacher, to evaluate what students say about the different presences at some stage, then introduce some changes to the online learning environment, introduce different semiotic resources, perhaps with particular intentions to increase social presence or increase teaching presence, and then evaluate to what extent then in that next stage we have an improvement as intended or not from the perspective of students if you conduct that survey again. Here, this particular class seemed to really benefit, this particular online learning environment seemed to really benefit from the intervention. We see improvement in all three presences if you look at the green, which is your stage 3 post-intervention. What is also very interesting here is that in the post-intervention interviews with the instructors seemed to really reflect a lot more on their practice and to use the terms, both terms referring to specific semiotic resources other than language, but also terms to refer to the different presences very explicitly. So the community of inquiry framework was also something they could use for reflective practice. So here we have that instructor of that class B talking about, after the intervention, teaching presence is the design and organization of everything we do before going into the classroom and the scaffolding techniques we use in the classroom. It's just as TESOL trainers, there is an added level that makes it really intense. We often have to call back to or make explicit the design, the organization, and the scaffolding, and check that students understand what's going on behind the scenes. And this is another very good reason, in addition to his considerable experience in TESOL context and also as a teacher of English earlier on himself and as a learning designer. So Stafford chose to focus on TESOL teacher education, not only because of that personal background, but also because in TESOL teacher education, we have a much stronger, perhaps, awareness of the role that multimodal communication plays in teaching and learning alongside language, and also of the need to model to our students who would be teachers of languages themselves or of English themselves, to model teaching in the classroom or in the online learning environment. I think that's about it. I hope I haven't quite overwhelmed you. You can appreciate then how overwhelmed I feel with the richness of the studies that my students engage in and how much I've learned from them. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Big round of applause for Dr. Djonov, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Djonov, for the insightful presentation. We will now have some question and answer. However, due to the constraint of time, we will have one question, if that's all right. Anyone, okay. Please raise your hand if you have any question. Thank you. Question? I think Dr. Emilia Djonov has given her email address at her last slide. So if you would like to have more questions, we can email Dr. Djonov if that's okay.
And then I can forward them to my students.
Sure. Another big round of applause for Dr. Emilia Djonov. Thank you very much. Dr. Djonov, thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Please stay here. You're in the right room. There are 3 British Council sessions now on British Council commissioned research. I'm very pleased that you're with us. I think we're going to wait for about 1 minute to allow people to come to the room. And there's my colleague Tata. You're going to be in room 8. Right. So if you don't know me, my name is Colm Downs. I'm the Director for English Education and Society at the British Council, Indonesia. For this session, now we are going to be joined by an Indonesian academic based in Australia, Subhan Zain. Subhan, can you hear me? Well, see if Subhan can hear us. I know that there are multiple breakout rooms now for
recording
many sessions.
stopped.
So we will just get set up. And let's see if Subhan can hear us. Okay. Okay, I hope, Subhan, can you hear us? I think you are here, but it's not appearing on our screen in this room at the moment. So I'm going to ask the committee, can we get the correct screen displayed? Hi, can I ask the committee to get the correct screen live streamed? I think, Ibu, can we get the correct screen displayed? I'm waiting for Subhan Zain. Subhan Zain is in the room on my phone. Hello? Yeah. He has joined the link. Can you? This should be the main room.
same is in the